Welcome to the Roots of Fear, where the darkest secrets hidden in plain sight are brought into the light. I'm your host, and today we're descending into a story that has haunted the small town of Blackwood Hollow for generations, a tale of corruption, power, and 7 secrets resting beneath perfectly kept roses. There was always a heavier feeling in the air around Langridge Manor. Perched at the crest of Raven's Hill, the Victorian mansion cast a long shadow over our town, both in the literal sense and something deeper. For 80 years, 3 generations of the Langridge family controlled everything: the town council, the police department, the local newspaper, even the price of bread. But no empire lasts forever. And when the Langridge dynasty finally fell, it exposed secrets far darker than anyone could have imagined. My connection to this story runs deep. My grandmother worked as a maid at Langridge Manor for nearly 4 decades. She rarely spoke of her time there, but when she did, her voice would fall to a whisper, and her eyes would dart nervously, as if the walls themselves were listening. "The Langridges always get what they want," she'd say. "And God help anyone who stands in their way." It was only after her passing that I discovered her journals, detailed accounts of everything she observed while working in the manor. Those journals, combined with old newspapers, town records, and interviews with elderly residents, allowed me to piece together the true story of the Langridge family and the 7 graves hidden beneath their prize-winning garden. Our story opens in 1938, when Harold Langridge arrived in Blackwood Hollow with his young wife, Eleanor. The Great Depression had left the town desperate, its once thriving lumber industry all but gone. Harold, a banker from Boston with mysterious connections and seemingly endless resources, presented himself as a savior. "I see potential in this town," he announced at a hastily arranged town meeting. With the right investments and leadership, Blackwood Hollow could become a jewel of the Northeast. Hope is a powerful motivator, especially for the desperate. Within months, Harold had purchased the abandoned lumber mill, the newspaper, and several businesses along Main Street. He hired local men at wages that seemed generous for the times, though they were far below standard rates elsewhere. Still, to a town on the brink of collapse, Harold Langridge appeared nothing short of miraculous. With his economic stronghold secure, Harold turned to politics. The mayor at the time, William Porter, initially welcomed Harold's investments but grew uneasy about his expanding influence. According to town council minutes from April 1939, Porter questioned whether one man should control so many vital businesses. 3 weeks later, the Blackwood Chronicle, now owned by Langridge, published a series of articles exposing Porter's supposed gambling debts and alleging an affair with his secretary. Porter vehemently denied the accusations, but the damage was done. He resigned in disgrace, and in the special election that followed, Harold Langridge became mayor by a landslide. My grandmother's journal entry from that time reads, "Mr. Langridge celebrated his election with a grand party at the manor. As I served champagne, I overheard him tell a business associate, 'Power isn't taken. It's given freely by fools who don't recognize what they're handing over.'" When Mrs. Langridge asked about Mayor Porter, Mr. Langridge just smiled and said, "Some problems solve themselves when properly motivated." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. Porter left town shortly after the election, his reputation in tatters. No one heard from him again. Years later, when I was researching this story, I tried to track what happened to him. Official records showed he moved to Chicago and died of liver failure in 1943. But when I contacted the cemetery where he was supposedly buried, they had no record of him. William Porter was just the first of many who crossed the Langridges and then vanished or met with tragedy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. With Harold as mayor, Langridge Manor became the center of power in Blackwood Hollow. Built in 1898 by a lumber baron, the manor sat on 10 acres of wooded land. Harold and Eleanor began renovations immediately, but the most significant change came to the gardens. Eleanor Langridge, it seemed, had a passion for horticulture. "Mrs. Langridge spends hours in the garden," my grandmother wrote in the summer of 1940. "She's transformed the entire east section into a rose garden with varieties I've never seen before." The west garden, however, remains strictly off-limits. Mr. Langridge has installed a high fence around it with a padlocked gate. Mrs. Langridge tells the staff it's for experimental plantings that need special protection, but I've seen them both entering at night, carrying strange tools. The West Garden would remain a mystery for decades, its secrets literally buried beneath the soil. But as Harold consolidated his power throughout the 1940s, the Langridge influence grew like the roses in Eleanor's garden, beautiful on the surface, but hiding thorns that drew blood. By 1945, Harold controlled the town council, the police department, and most major businesses. Anyone who opposed him found themselves facing tax audits, denied business licenses, or worse. The few who spoke out publicly suffered mysterious accidents or suddenly decided to move away. One such case was Thomas Green, editor of a small independent newsletter that criticized Langridge's business practices. In October 1945, Green published an article questioning how Harold had acquired the funds to purchase so many properties during the Depression. A week later, Green's office burned to the ground in what police ruled an accidental fire caused by faulty wiring. Green survived but left town immediately. Years later, when I tracked down his daughter in Portland, she told me Dad never talked about Blackwood Hollow. The night of the fire, he packed us up and we left before dawn. The only thing he ever said was, never cross a man who's willing to bury his problems. Did Thomas Green know something about the Langridge Gardens? It's impossible to say for certain, but his choice of words seems eerily prescient given what we now know. In 1947, Harold and Eleanor welcomed their only child, a son named Richard. My grandmother's journals described the lavish celebration that followed. The christening was attended by state senators, judges, even a congressman. Mr. Langridge paraded his son through the party like a trophy. "This boy will inherit everything," he told everyone within earshot. "The Langridges are here to stay." Richard grew up as Blackwood Hollow's prince, pampered and protected, his every whim catered to. Teachers were instructed to give him perfect grades regardless of his performance. Local children were encouraged to befriend him, or rather to serve as his entourage. "Young Master Richard has his father's temperament," my grandmother wrote when Richard was 10. Today, he flew into a rage when the gardener's boy beat him in a foot race. Later, I saw Mr. Langridge give the gardener an envelope and tell him his services would no longer be needed. The gardener looked terrified and kept saying, "Please, Mr. Langridge, my boy didn't mean any harm." Mr. Langridge just smiled that cold smile of his and said, "I'm sure your talents will be appreciated elsewhere. I suggest you find that place quickly." The gardener and his family left town that night. Like William Porter and Thomas Green before them, they seemingly vanished. And once again, when I tried to track them down decades later, the trail went cold in a way that defied coincidence. But the true darkness at the heart of the Langridge Empire wouldn't begin to surface until the winter of 1956, when Eleanor Langridge fell ill with what was initially diagnosed as pneumonia. As her condition worsened, Harold brought in specialists from Boston and New York, but nothing seemed to help. "Mrs. Langridge fades more each day," my grandmother wrote in February 1956. The doctors seem baffled. "Yesterday, as I was changing her bedding, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, 'The West Garden. He thinks I don't know what it's for.'" Before she could say more, Mr. Langridge entered and she fell silent immediately. Eleanor died 3 days later. The official cause was listed as complications from pneumonia, but rumors spread through the staff that her symptoms had been strange: nosebleeds, hair loss, stomach pains. Symptoms that, to modern ears, might suggest poisoning. Harold's mourning was brief and performative. Within 6 months, he had married his secretary, Victoria, a woman 20 years his junior with ambitions that matched his own. Victoria took to her role as the new Mrs. Langridge with calculating precision, charming the town's elite while helping Harold tighten his grip on local politics. Interestingly, Victoria showed no interest in maintaining Eleanor's beloved Rose Garden, which quickly fell into disrepair. The West Garden, however, remained carefully tended and strictly off-limits. Richard, now 9 years old, reportedly hated his new stepmother. My grandmother's journals detail increasingly bitter arguments between the boy and Victoria, with Harold always taking his wife's side. "Master Richard grows more sullen by the day," she wrote in 1957. "This morning I heard him tell Victoria, 'My real mother knew what you are.' Victoria slapped him hard enough to leave a mark, then told him, 'Your mother knew nothing, especially when to keep quiet.' Remember that. The implication is chilling in retrospect. Did Eleanor Langridge discover something about the West Garden that led to her death? And was Victoria already aware of its secrets? As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Harold's health began to decline, heart problems, officially, though he remained a formidable presence in town politics. Victoria increasingly took on public duties, presenting herself as the devoted wife supporting her ailing husband. Behind closed doors, according to my grandmother, she was positioning herself for power. Mrs. Victoria has been meeting privately with the town council members, my grandmother noted in 1962. Last night, I overheard her tell Mr. Langridge, they'll support me when the time comes. I've made sure of it. Mr. Langridge laughed and said, just remember our arrangement. Richard is my legacy. Mrs. Victoria's response was disturbing. Legacies can be rewritten, Harold. You taught me that. Harold Langridge died in his sleep on December 12, 1963. At his funeral, the governor gave a eulogy, praising his contributions to Blackwood Hollow. Victoria played the grieving widow perfectly, while 16-year-old Richard stood stoically beside her. What followed surprised no one in Blackwood Hollow but raised eyebrows elsewhere. Victoria, with the unanimous support of the town council, assumed all of Harold's positions: mayor, bank president, and head of the Chamber of Commerce. Richard, despite being Harold's only blood heir, received a modest trust fund but no control over the family businesses or properties, including Langridge Manor. The arrangement seemed to violate Harold's oft-stated intention that his son would inherit everything. But Victoria produced a will, conveniently witnessed by 2 council members, that specified the new arrangement. Richard contested it, of course, but the local judge, appointed years earlier by Harold, ruled quickly in Victoria's favor. My grandmother's entry following the ruling is telling. Master Richard stormed into the manor today, shouting that he would expose everything. I know what's in the West Garden, he yelled at Mrs. Victoria. I know what father did and what you helped him cover up. Mrs. Victoria didn't raise her voice, but her words turned my blood cold. Be very careful, Richard, she said. There's always room for one more. Your father taught me to be thorough. Room for one more? What? At the time, my grandmother didn't know. None of us did. But Richard must have understood the threat because he left Blackwood Hollow the next day, supposedly to attend college in California. For the next decade, Victoria Langridge ruled Blackwood Hollow with the same iron control as her husband, but with a more sophisticated approach. She modernized the town's image, attracting light industry and tourism. On the surface, Blackwood Hollow prospered. Beneath that prosperity, Victoria's network of influence ensured that no decision happened without her approval. The West Garden remained off-limits, tended now by a groundskeeper who came to the manor only at night and spoke to no one. My grandmother noted that the fence had been reinforced and that Victoria occasionally visited the garden alone, always returning looking satisfied, like someone checking that their valuables remained secure. In 1974, Richard Langridge returned to Blackwood Hollow. Now 27, he had graduated from Stanford and earned an MBA from Harvard. He came home ostensibly to reconcile with his stepmother and take a position at the family bank. Victoria welcomed him publicly but remained suspicious. My grandmother observed their careful dance around each other, all politeness in public, thinly veiled hostility in private. They circle each other like wolves, she wrote. Master Richard has his father's smile now, all teeth, no warmth. Mrs. Victoria watches him constantly. Neither trusts the other, but they've reached some sort of understanding. That understanding apparently involved Richard gradually taking over the business aspects of the Langridge empire while Victoria maintained political control. For several years, they coexisted in this arrangement, though the tension between them never dissipated. The balance shifted in 1978 when Richard married Catherine Walsh, daughter of a state senator. Catherine was beautiful, educated, and brought political connections that extended beyond Blackwood Hollow. Victoria clearly perceived her as a threat. At the wedding reception held at Langridge Manor, my grandmother overheard a telling exchange. Victoria cornered Catherine by the rose garden, away from the other guests. You've married into a complicated family, she told the bride. The Langridges have traditions and secrets that must be respected. Catherine, to her credit, didn't flinch. Richard has told me everything, she replied. Victoria's face hardened. I doubt that very much, she said. But if he has, then you should be very careful about the choices you make. Whether Richard had actually told Catherine about everything remains unclear, but the young couple clearly presented a united front against Victoria. Over the next 2 years, Richard systematically expanded his influence, buying businesses outside Victoria's control and cultivating relationships with county and state officials. Victoria responded by doubling down on her local power base, particularly the police department and town council. The conflict remained largely beneath the surface: hostile board meetings, competing donations to local causes, whisper campaigns, until Catherine announced her pregnancy in 1980. The news should have been cause for celebration, the next generation of Langridge to continue the dynasty. Instead, it escalated the Cold War between Richard and Victoria into something more dangerous. According to my grandmother's journals, Victoria was overheard saying, "No child of that woman will control what I've built." Richard, meanwhile, began telling business associates that changes are coming to Langridge Manor. My son will grow up in a house cleansed of past mistakes. What exactly he meant by cleansed became apparent a few months later when Richard hired contractors to renovate the east wing of the manor, including Eleanor's neglected rose garden. Victoria was furious, especially when she learned that the renovation plans eventually included the mysterious west garden as well. Mrs. Victoria forbade the contractors from touching the west garden, my grandmother wrote. When Richard insisted, she threatened to disinherit him completely. "That garden stays as it is," she told him, "or you'll regret challenging me." Master Richard refused to back down. "The time for your secrets is over," he told her. "After the baby comes, everything changes." The baby, a boy named Harold after his grandfather, was born in November 1980. Catherine suffered complications during delivery and remained in the hospital for several weeks. During this time, Victoria made her move. On December 3, 1980, Richard was arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The evidence presented by Victoria's loyal police chief appeared damning: falsified loan documents, offshore accounts, missing funds from the Langridge Foundation. Richard proclaimed his innocence, insisting Victoria had framed him, but few in town were willing to challenge her accusations. Catherine, still recovering from childbirth, tried to rally support for her husband. She reached out to her father, the state senator, who began making inquiries. But before those inquiries could gain traction, tragedy struck again. On December 18, Catherine and baby Harold were driving back from a meeting with Richard's lawyers when their car went off Raven's Bridge, plunging into the icy river below. By the time emergency services reached them, Catherine was dead. The baby, strapped securely in his car seat, survived with only minor injuries. The official report cited icy conditions and brake failure as the cause of the accident. No investigation beyond the initial police report was ever conducted. Senator Walsh, devastated by his daughter's death, stopped pushing for an inquiry into Richard's case. Victoria immediately took custody of her great stepson. Richard, in jail awaiting trial, was now isolated and powerless. His request for a change of venue was denied by the local judge. In February 1981, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 20 years in prison. My grandmother's journal entry from the day of sentencing is heartbreaking. Master Richard looked defeated today. As they led him from the courtroom, he looked directly at me, the first time he's acknowledged me since he was a boy. "Tell them about the garden," he said before the bailiff pulled him away. "Someone needs to know what's buried there." Mrs. Victoria heard him. The look she gave me chilled me to the bone. The next day, my grandmother was fired after nearly 40 years of service to the Langridge family. Victoria cited budget cuts as the reason, but the message was clear. My grandmother moved in with my parents and me, bringing her journals but never speaking openly about her time at the manor. For the next decade, Victoria Langridge ruled Blackwood Hollow unchallenged, raising young Harold as her heir apparent. The boy rarely appeared in public, educated by private tutors and kept isolated at the manor. When seen, he appeared well cared for but unnaturally subdued for a child his age. The West Garden remained Victoria's secret, its high fence now supplemented with security cameras and motion sensors. Whatever lay buried there, she was determined to protect it. Richard Langridge served 10 years of his sentence before being released on parole in 1991. By then, Victoria was in her 70s but showed no signs of relinquishing control. Richard, now 44, returned to Blackwood Hollow despite the terms of his parole allowing him to live anywhere in the state. "I have unfinished business in my hometown," he told the local newspaper in a rare interview. "And a son I barely know." Victoria used every legal means to keep Richard away from young Harold, now 10 years old, restraining orders, supervised visitation restrictions, even having Richard's parole conditions modified to limit his movements around town. But Richard was patient, methodically rebuilding his life and reputation. He found work at a real estate office in the neighboring town, lived modestly, and began attending community events where he knew Harold might be present. Gradually, he established himself as a changed man, humble, hard-working, and unfailingly polite, even to those who had testified against him at his trial. By 1995, Richard had earned enough goodwill to successfully petition for regular visitation with Harold. Victoria fought the petition bitterly but finally faced a judge not under her influence. As Harold entered his teenage years, he began spending weekends with the father he had been taught to fear. My grandmother, now living with us full-time, followed these developments with great interest but increasing frailty. Her journals from this period show a woman torn between a desire to reveal what she knew and fear of Victoria's retribution. "I should tell Richard what I saw in the West Garden," she wrote in 1996. "But even now, with Victoria's power fading, I'm afraid. The Langridges protect their secrets. They always have." What exactly had my grandmother seen? She never wrote it explicitly, perhaps fearing her journals might be discovered, but she left clues, references to midnight digging in the early years, to Harold and Victoria entering the garden with bundles that they didn't bring out again, to counting the roses planted after certain townspeople disappeared. Victoria Langridge died in her sleep on January 7, 1998, at the age of 81. Her funeral was attended by state dignitaries and local officials whose careers she had shaped. Richard and 16-year-old Harold stood side by side at the graveside, their expressions unreadable. Within weeks, Richard had moved back into Langridge Manor with his son. The town held its breath, waiting to see what changes the returned heir would bring. But Richard surprised everyone with his moderate approach. "Blackwood Hollow has been ruled by fear for too long," he announced at his first town council meeting. "It's time for transparency and shared prosperity." Many welcomed the change. Others, particularly those who had benefited most from Victoria's regime, were less enthusiastic. But after decades under Langridge control, the town had forgotten how to effectively oppose the family. Through it all, the West Garden remained untouched, its fence maintained, its secrets preserved. Whatever Richard had known or suspected as a younger man, he showed no public interest in excavating the space. Perhaps, some speculated, he had made peace with the past. My grandmother died in 2000, taking her unspoken knowledge to the grave. I inherited her journals but didn't immediately read them. Busy with college and then my career in journalism, they sat in a box in my parents' attic, their secrets waiting to be discovered. Richard Langridge proved to be a different kind of leader than his father or stepmother. Over the next decade, he gradually divested the family of many of its business interests, selling the newspaper to its employees and converting the bank to a community credit union. He remained mayor but advocated for term limits and more transparent governance. Harold Langridge III graduated from college in 2002 and, unlike his father, showed little interest in returning to Blackwood Hollow. He built a career in environmental science, eventually settling in Seattle with his wife and children. His visits home became increasingly rare. As Richard aged, Langridge Manor began to show signs of neglect. The once immaculate grounds grew overgrown, with only the most basic maintenance performed. The East Garden, once Eleanor's pride, became a meadow of wildflowers and weeds. Only the West Garden strangely remained tended, its fence repaired when necessary, its lock replaced when rusted. In 2018, Richard Langridge suffered a severe stroke. At 71, he was airlifted to a specialized facility in Boston, where doctors determined he would require long-term care. Harold returned to Blackwood Hollow to settle his father's affairs. "The manor is falling apart," he told the town council. "My father's medical care will be expensive and ongoing. I intend to sell the property for development." The announcement sent shockwaves through Blackwood Hollow. Langridge Manor had stood as the town centerpiece for generations. The idea of luxury condos or a resort replacing it struck many as sacrilegious. But Harold was determined, and no one, not even on the council, had the authority to stop him. It was around this time that I rediscovered my grandmother's journals while helping my parents downsize. Reading her careful documentation of Langridge secrets spanning 4 decades, I was alternately fascinated and horrified. The picture that emerged was of a family that had maintained power through manipulation, intimidation, and possibly worse. The West Garden remained the central mystery. What had my grandmother seen there that she dared not explicitly describe? What had Richard meant when he told her to tell them about the garden as he was led away to prison? With Harold preparing to sell the manor and 80 years of Langridge rule coming to an end, I decided it was finally time to investigate. As a journalist with contacts in the County Historical Society, I reached out to Harold with a proposal to document the manor before its sale, emphasizing the historical significance of preserving the record. To my surprise, he agreed readily. "I have no attachment to that house or its history," he told me over the phone. "Document whatever you want. Just don't interfere with the sale." In April 2019, I began my survey of Langridge Manor. The house itself was impressive despite its deterioration, 30 rooms of Victorian grandeur slowly surrendering to time and neglect. I photographed, measured, and catalogued each space, working my way methodically through the mansion. But it was the gardens that truly interested me. The East Garden, once Eleanor's showcase, was now an overgrown tangle. Traces of pathways and flower beds remained visible beneath the weeds, like the skeleton of a once beautiful creature. And then there was the West Garden. The fence surrounding it was newer than the rest of the property, reinforced chain link topped with barbed wire, installed sometime in the 1990s, according to the manufacturer's tag. The padlock was recent, too, and substantial. I called Harold in Seattle. "I need access to the West Garden to complete the documentation," I explained. His hesitation was palpable, even over the phone. "That won't be necessary," he said finally. "That section isn't part of the sale. It's being maintained separately." "Maintained by whom?" I pressed. Another pause. "There's a trust," he said vaguely. "Set up by my great-grandfather. It's complicated legal stuff that even I don't fully understand, but that garden stays as is. It was a condition of my inheritance." His answer only deepened my suspicion. A trust specifically for a garden maintained for over 80 years despite changes in ownership and family dynamics? It made no sense unless there was something valuable or damning hidden there. I considered my options. Breaking into the garden would be trespassing, possibly criminal. But my grandmother's journals and the evasiveness of 3 generations of Langridge convinced me that whatever lay behind that fence was the key to understanding how this family had controlled our town for so long. That night, I returned to the manor with bolt cutters and a flashlight. The old house loomed against the starry sky, its windows dark and accusing. I made my way around to the West Garden fence, heart pounding with each step. The lock yielded with a sharp snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. I pushed the gate open, wincing at its creak, and stepped into the forbidden garden. My first impression was of surprising orderliness. Unlike the wild tangle of the East Garden, this space was meticulously maintained. 7 rose bushes, evenly spaced, formed a perfect circle in the center of the garden. Each bush was a different variety, some clearly very old, their trunks thick and gnarled. Around the perimeter ran a gravel path, neatly edged and recently raked. The care taken with this space stood in stark contrast to the neglect evident everywhere else on the property. I approached the circle of roses cautiously, playing my flashlight over the ground. The soil between the bushes was bare and appeared recently turned. No weeds, no other plantings, just dark, rich earth surrounding 7 carefully tended roses. I recognized the pattern now from my grandmother's cryptic references. 7 roses for 7 secrets, 7 plants marking 7 buried problems that the Langridge had eliminated over 80 years of rule. With shaking hands, I began to dig beside the oldest-looking rose bush. The soil yielded easily, clearly turned regularly over the years. About 2 feet down, my trowel struck something solid. Carefully, I brushed away the dirt to reveal what looked like fabric, decayed but still recognizable as a fine wool suit. I recoiled, my worst fears confirmed. Fighting nausea, I continued excavating, uncovering what was unmistakably human remains. Based on the deterioration, this body had been buried decades ago. Moving to the next rose bush, I dug again. Another body, this one with scraps of what might have been a uniform. Perhaps the gardener who had been dismissed after his son outran young Richard Langridge. One by one, I checked each rose bush, finding human remains beneath each one. 7 graves, just as the title of this video suggests. 7 people who had stood in the way of Langridge ambitions. 7 lives ended to protect the family's power. I was photographing the evidence when floodlights suddenly illuminated the garden. Momentarily blinded, I raised my hand to shield my eyes. When my vision cleared, I found myself facing the barrel of a shotgun held by an elderly man I didn't recognize. "Mr. Langridge has been expecting someone to come poking around eventually," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "Been waiting for it since he had his stroke." "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "Groundskeeper. Family retainer. Same job my father had, and his father before him." He gestured with the shotgun. "The Langridges take care of their loyal servants. Do you know what's buried here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man's face remained impassive. "I tend the roses. That's my job. What's under them isn't my concern. These are human remains," I said. "Murders. Don't you care about justice?" Something flickered across his weathered face, regret, perhaps, or resignation. "Justice is a luxury, miss. Survival is a necessity. The Langridges made sure my family survived when others didn't." He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a cell phone. "Mr. Harold is on his way from Seattle. Took the company jet when the security system was breached. He'll be here by morning to deal with this situation. These people deserve proper burials," I insisted. "Their families deserve to know what happened to them." The groundskeeper shrugged. "Most of their families are long gone or moved away. And the ones still here, they've built lives on Langridge charity. Langridge scholarships educated their children. Langridge loans bought their homes. You think they want to know their comfort was built on blood money?" He had a point, however disturbing. The Langridge influence was woven into every aspect of Blackwood Hollow. How many current residents would want to learn that their prosperity was founded on murder? But I couldn't walk away. Not with the evidence literally at my feet. I had to find a way to document this discovery and escape before Harold arrived. "The police," I began. The groundskeeper laughed harshly. "Chief Williams?" His grandfather was appointed by Harold Langridge, Sr. His father served under Victoria. The chief himself owes his position to Richard. You think he doesn't know about this garden? My options were dwindling. The groundskeeper watched me carefully, shotgun steady. "Sun's coming up in a few hours," he said. "Best get comfortable. Mr. Harold will want to talk to you personally." As dawn broke over Langridge Manor, I heard the sound of a helicopter approaching. The groundskeeper nodded in satisfaction. Right on time. Mr. Harold always was efficient. The helicopter landed on the manor's vast front lawn. Minutes later, Harold Langridge III strode into the garden. At 39, he looked remarkably like the photographs of his grandfather in his prime, tall, distinguished, with the same cold eyes that had surveyed Blackwood Hollow from a position of power for generations. He took in the scene, the excavated graves, my camera, the groundskeeper's shotgun, with a single glance. "Well," he said finally, "it seems we have a situation." "These are murder victims," I said, finding my courage. 7 people killed by your family to maintain their control over this town." Harold sighed, looking genuinely tired. "Actually, it's 8. 8. I echoed, confused. He gestured to an empty space near the fence. "Victoria." Her final request was to join the others. A strange sort of atonement, I suppose. My father honored it, though I never understood why. The casual way he confirmed my allegations was shocking. "You know about all this, the murders." "I know my family history," he said simply. "My father told me everything after Victoria died. How my great-grandfather eliminated political opponents. How Victoria continued the tradition, the Langridge way of handling problems. And you're just okay with that?" I couldn't keep the horror from my voice. Harold considered the roses thoughtfully. "I moved 3,000 miles away and built a life studying environmental remediation. What does that tell you?" Before I could answer, he turned to the groundskeeper. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. You can go now. Your services will no longer be required after today, but your pension remains secure." The old man lowered his shotgun, nodded once, and left the garden without looking back. Harold turned to me. "So, a journalist with evidence of historical murders committed by a once powerful family. What do you plan to do with this information?" "Justice?" I said firmly. "These people deserve justice." "Justice?" Harold repeated. "After 80 years, when everyone directly responsible is already dead, what does justice look like in this scenario?" He had a point, but I stood my ground. "The truth, then. People deserve to know what happened here." Harold nodded slowly. "The truth?" "Yes, I suppose they do." He looked around the garden at the 7 rose bushes marking 7 graves. "My father wanted this exposed, you know. After his stroke, when he knew he wouldn't recover enough to do it himself, he arranged for the security system to be less effective than it appeared. He wanted someone like you to find this place. Why didn't he just tell someone?" I asked. "The Langridge curse," Harold said with a bitter smile. "We're taught from childhood that family loyalty comes before everything. Even my father, who tried to break away, couldn't bring himself to directly betray that code. But he made it possible for others to discover the truth." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "This contains my father's complete confession. Names, dates, circumstances, everything he knew about what happened in this garden. He recorded it after his first stroke when he feared the second might take his speech. It also contains financial records showing how the Langridge fortune was built on extortion, fraud, and occasionally murder." He held out the drive to me. "The truth you're looking for. Use it as you see fit." I took it hesitantly, suspecting a trick. "Why would you give me this?" Harold looked at the excavated graves, his expression unreadable. "Because I have children of my own now. Because I don't want them to inherit this legacy. Because some cycles need to be broken." He turned back to me. "My father will die soon. The doctors give him months at most. With him dies the last Langridge who actively participated in the family's crimes. I've spent my life trying to atone through my environmental work, cleaning up other people's messes. Perhaps it's time I cleaned up my family's as well." "The police," I began again. "They'll be here within the hour," Harold finished. "I called them from the helicopter. Not Chief Williams, the state police. The manor is for sale as planned. The proceeds will establish a victims' compensation fund for the families of those buried here, if they can be identified, or for community restoration if they cannot." He looked around the garden one last time. 80 years of Langridge rule ends today. What happens next is up to you and the people of Blackwood Hollow. As promised, the state police arrived soon after. The investigation that followed dominated national headlines for weeks. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed 8 burial sites in the West Garden. Forensic anthropologists carefully exhumed the remains, working to identify each victim. William Porter, the mayor who opposed Harold Langridge, Sr. Thomas Green, the journalist who questioned the Langridge finances. Joseph Miller, the gardener whose son outran young Richard. Eleanor Langridge, murdered by her husband when she discovered his crimes. Senator Walsh's private investigator who had been looking into Richard's case. A state auditor who had begun examining Langridge Foundation records in 1974. The original groundskeeper who had known too much and threatened to talk. And finally, Victoria Langridge herself, buried as she requested beside her victims. Richard Langridge died before he could be charged with any crimes, including his complicity in Victoria's burial. Harold cooperated fully with the investigation, providing documents and testimony that implicated his ancestors while making it clear he had no personal involvement. The flash drive contained exactly what Harold had promised, a comprehensive account of the Langridge family's crimes over 80 years. Richard's confession was thorough and unflinching, detailing how each victim had threatened the family's power and how their elimination had been justified as necessary for the greater good of Blackwood Hollow. The revelation shook our town to its foundations. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the image of the Langridges as benevolent leaders. Others recalled whispered stories and suspicious disappearances that suddenly made terrible sense. Langridge Manor was eventually purchased by the County Historical Society and converted into a museum documenting both the family's contributions to the town and their crimes. The East Garden was restored to its former glory as a memorial to Eleanor. The West Garden became a solemn remembrance site for the victims, the rose bushes preserved as living markers of lives cut short. Harold Langridge kept his word about the Victims' Fund. He also established scholarships and community development grants designed to help Blackwood Hollow transition to a post-Langridge future. He never returned to the town after the investigation concluded, focusing instead on his family and work in Seattle. My grandmother's journals are now part of the Historical Society's archives, her observations helping to fill in gaps in the timeline. I often wonder how much she truly knew and how much she suspected but couldn't bring herself to acknowledge. Like so many in Blackwood Hollow, she had been caught between dependence on the Langridges and fear of their power. As for me, the article I wrote about the Langridge Garden won a Pulitzer and launched my career as an investigative journalist. But more importantly, it brought closure to families who had wondered for decades what had happened to their loved ones. William Porter's granddaughter, Thomas Green's children, Joseph Miller's descendants, all finally learned the truth about disappearances that had haunted their families for generations. The last time I visited Blackwood Hollow was for the opening of the Memorial Garden. Standing before the 7 rose bushes, now marked with the names of those buried beneath them, I reflected on how power corrupts and how secrets fester when left buried. The Langridge dynasty ruled our town for 80 years through a combination of economic control, political manipulation, and the strategic elimination of threats. Their garden hid the ultimate price of their power, 7 graves that testified to their willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain their position. But secrets rarely stay buried forever. Like the roses that marked their victims, the truth eventually found its way to the light. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Remember, the most terrifying stories aren't those of supernatural monsters or imagined horrors. They're the ones that reveal the darkness humans are capable of when power goes unchecked. Good night, and sleep well, if you can.